Welcome to the Struggle for Black Equality, a series of conversations that attempt to answer the question, why has it been such a struggle for Black Americans to gain basic civil rights, the right to eat in a restaurant, live in a neighborhood, go to a school, work a job, and be treated equally under the law? This conversation, Redeemers, the Fall of Black Equality, looks at the resurgence of white supremacy in the South under the Bourbon Redeemers in the 1870s and how the lost cause narrative, white terror, the collapse of Republican control, the Compromise of 1877, and sharecropping combined to overturn the gains made by Black Americans under radical Reconstruction. This map reminds us that freedom for millions of slaves occurred without a national consensus, within the context of a deeply divided nation unprepared to plot a viable path toward racial equality in slavery's aftermath. The Black Codes instituted by white Southerners after the war and slavery ended are a clear demonstration of this conflicted reality. During radical Reconstruction, a Republican-controlled Congress granted freed slaves citizenship, civil rights, and the right to vote, gains that unfortunately would be short-lived. John Mercer Langston described the significance of freedom in 1874 when he wrote, quote, "In our emancipation, it is fixed by law that the place where we are born is ipso facto our country, and this gives us a domicile, a home. As in slavery, we had no self-ownership, nor interest in anything external to ourselves, so we were without country and legal settlement. For it is now settled in the law that the country of his birth, even this beautiful and goodly land, is his country." Yes, Black Americans now had a home, a country, but what kind of home would it be? One where they were equal partners as citizens, or one where the legacy of slavery would haunt them for centuries to come? The Southern answer to that question was put forward in the 1867 book, The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War of the Confederates by Edward A. Pollock. Pollock argued that the war was about states' rights and not slavery. In the Lost Cause narrative, the South fought to preserve their pristine, rural, agrarian civilization against Northern industrialists determined to destroy the South. The narrative saw Robert E. Lee as the ultimate Christian soldier fighting to preserve the South. In succeeding years, the Lost Cause narrative celebrated the defeat of radical Reconstruction, and by the 1890s developed into a racial argument that argued slavery was beneficial to both races and that blacks could not handle living in freedom. The most radical and violent white Southerners came together in a movement to terrorize blacks to advance the Lost Cause narrative and restore what the South had lost in the war. The most well-known of many white terror groups was the Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865. The first Grand Wizard of the Klan was Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, pictured here. The historian of the Klan, Allen W. Trelease, wrote that the Klan, quote, "whipped, shot, hanged, robbed, raped, and otherwise outraged Negroes and Republicans across the South in the name of preserving white civilization." In 1870, with the Reconstruction Amendments in place and Southern states readmitted, Northern commitment to black equality waned. The amendments seemed to be enough for many Northerners. In addition, the North became distracted by other national issues, such as protective tariffs and industrialization. White terror and Southern intransigence also wore down the North's resolve. The absence of a forceful Northern presence opened the door to a new group of Southern Democrats, fueled by a strong belief in the Lost Cause narrative and bent on restoring their lost civilization. These new Democrats, called Bourbon Redeemers because they had learned little from the war and believed they were redeeming their lost society, came to power and immediately began to set the clocks back by defunding the new schools, expanding convict leasing, and instituting the earliest forms of segregation. The Compromise of 1877 solidified the end of Reconstruction, the return of control to white Southerners, and the fall of black equality. In the presidential election of 1876, no candidate achieved a majority in the Electoral College because Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana could not determine who won in their states. The compromise reached between Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats was that the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, became president and the Army would be removed from the South. Reconstruction came to an end, again, not by moral consensus, but by political compromise. One of the most important elements of the Reconstruction era was discussed but never accomplished: the distribution of land to freed slaves. General William Tecumseh Sherman began this discussion during the war when he issued Field Order No. 15, which set aside a 30-mile wide tract of land along the coast from South Carolina to Florida for distribution to freed slaves. The idea gained momentum in 1865 when the government decided to carve out 40-acre plots from lands confiscated from Confederates to be given to black families. The Freedmen's Bureau was charged with managing the distribution, which was falsely rumored would include a mule. Quickly, though, President Johnson backed away from land distribution and ultimately chose to return the land to its original owners, white Southerners. In the absence of land distribution, the system that replaced slavery was sharecropping. Freed slaves faced limited choices. Prevalent racism made the North resistant to mass migration. To move west required resources that freed slaves did not possess. With no capital and nowhere else to go, most freed slaves were left with no choice but to become sharecroppers, often on land they previously worked as slaves. Sharecroppers signed a one-year contract to rent a piece of land. Without money to pay rent, sharecroppers agreed to work the land and share the crop with the owner, usually about 50%. Sharecroppers also had to borrow at interest everything necessary to farm. The system left the sharecropper in perpetual debt and tenancy. Systemic denial of access to economic advancement through land ownership continued throughout the 20th century. In the 1930s, when the government began home ownership initiatives to combat the foreclosures of the Great Depression, blacks were excluded from access to government-guaranteed home loans by a practice known as redlining, color-coding black neighborhoods in red to designate people and neighborhoods where loans were high risk. Both government and banks participated in redlining for decades, denying millions of black Americans the opportunity to own their own home. Later, after World War II, the government excluded black veterans from getting VA loans to purchase one of the new homes being built in the suburbs for returning veterans. The logic was that blacks and whites could not live together, and black families living in the neighborhood would reduce property values. The homes for vets in Levittown, New York sold for $8,000. Today, these same homes sell for $400,000. Discrimination in home ownership is one of many reasons why today black Americans earn an income of about 60% of white Americans, but have only 5% of the wealth of white Americans. Some takeaways from today's conversation. Southerners developed a narrative which portrayed the Civil War as a lost cause of a good society, and used this narrative to justify the white terror they used against blacks to limit their rise to equal status. Northern Republicans ultimately tired of Southern issues and became distracted by other national issues more important to them in the 1870s, which allowed white Democrats, the Redeemers, to regain control of Southern states and reestablish white supremacy. The failure to distribute land to freed slaves resulted in a system of sharecropping that kept Southern blacks in a perpetual state of debt and bare subsistence, not much different from their economic state under the slave economy. Some things to think about. What does John Mercer Langston's statement that emancipation gave the freed slave a home tell us about the psychological effects of slavery? Why did Southerners argue in their lost cause narrative that the war was about states' rights and not slavery? What were the strengths and weaknesses of the idea of distributing confiscated lands to freed slaves? Some resources. John Mercer Langston's speech, Equality Before the Law of 1874, Frederick Douglass's autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass of 1845, and Edward A. Pollock's The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War of the Confederates of 1867. Thanks for joining this conversation today. God bless you, have a great day, and keep thinking about things that matter.